participation in the G20 process. And it is Korea's hope to bring this conference to Korea, if possible, next year. So this cooperation and bilateral relationship with Australia would become even more important in the years to come. You have emphasized the need to avoid protectionism in the global economic management. And I think that the FTA, the Free Trade Agreement mechanism, is perhaps the most noticeable device to avoid protectionism in the global market. And what is your prospect of the Australian relationship with other countries in the region for FTA arrangement, and especially with Korea, the possible FTAs with Korea? Do you see any possibilities and obstacles in the pursuit of those FTAs?
Well, Mr. Chairman, you get to an area here where I think it's very important that we not elevate process and form ahead of substance. If we don't negotiate a free trade agreement with Korea, we will still have a very close economic relationship. Now, I hope we do. I can equally say the same thing with China. We're having free trade negotiations with China at the present time. I don't know how they're going to end up. They were started by my government. They're being continued by the new Australian government. But let me say that even if they fell over tomorrow, and I don't believe that will happen for a moment, we would still have an immensely valuable relationship with China. I think my point is that there's always a danger that you elevate form and process ahead of substance. And I guess that relates back to the point I made earlier, that I think we have to avoid adding yet further layers of governance, further layers of associations to what already exists. You have to look at the substance of the cooperation in this region. You have a look at the substance of the bilateral trade relations between countries. And I think of our three great trading partners in North Asia. I think of China and Japan and Korea. Well, historically, I should really say Japan, Korea, China in order in which each of them became a very important export destination. We don't have free trade agreements with them, but gee, they take an enormous amount of our product, an enormous volume of our natural resources, and we buy an enormous product. I mean, 71% or something of clothing imports into Australia now come from China. We've been buying motor vehicles from Korea and of course even further back Japan. I mean, Japan was so much the engine of externally of economic growth in Australia in the 1960s, 70s and 80s, and historically Japan was very, very important to Australia's economic development, something we in Australia should never forget. So I guess the point I'm making is that it's the substance. I think we can make a mistake if we benchmark success according to whether you negotiate a free trade agreement. They're valuable, providing, of course, they adhere to proper international trading principles. A lot of people don't like free trade agreements. A lot of theorists don't like free trade agreements because they think they derogate from the concept of multilateral trade agreements. In the absence of a revitalised Doha round, they're really the next best thing. But in the end, it's the substance of that relationship. So I hope we get a free trade agreement with Korea, and I'm sure the Korean government hopes we do. But let me say right now, if we don't, it will not be the end of the world in the relationship. It will still be a very close and affectionate one in both people to people and trade terms.
Well, I think that Korea and Australia together stand at the forefront of globalization and actively engaged in the global economic system, which is continuously changing. And in my view, it is very natural that Korea now, having signed a free trade agreement with the United States and at the last stage of negotiating with the European Union, and also signed the comprehensive economic partnership with India, that Korea and Australia could perhaps sit down and talk more seriously about the FTAs, which will bring mutual benefits to both countries. Korea is now the fourth largest economic partner of Australia, and we import lots of minerals from your country. And also it is true that there are concerns about the agricultural products and dairy products from Australia coming into Korea. So I think we should have a very balanced view on the benefits, the mutual benefits of the FTA, so that we can come to a mutual agreement. Let me ask you one more question about your point on China. You mentioned several times that in the Asia-Pacific community, China is very important. It's a very pragmatic relationship with China. Australia is now pursuing. And we need to take account of the growing economic influence of China in analyzing the new changes in East Asia and the Pacific region. You are a long-time ally of the United States. You have a very good relationship with Japan, Singapore, and Indonesia, and Korea. But at the same time, you are depending on your economic relationship with China increasingly. And recently I noticed that the new Australian government has announced a vision for the Asia-Pacific community. I think it's an extension of the APEC structure in the Asia-Pacific region. What is your view on the future role of China in the regional economic integration and also strategic relationship with a country like Australia?
Well, my view in relation to China has for a long time been that China's growth and emergence has not only been good for China but also good for the world. I've always taken a very positive view about the reality of China's economic growth and expansion. I personally think it is inevitable at some time, I don't know when, that there will be an internal clash between economic liberalisation and political authoritarianism. Many people disagree with that. I don't know when it will occur, but eventually I think a country finds it very difficult to progress down the path of economic liberalisation whilst maintaining political authoritarianism. Now, probably a lot of people in the audience who disagree with me on that, but I hold to that view very strongly. But that, in a sense, is for the future, and it's a matter for the Chinese to resolve, but of course it will obviously have implications for our region and the rest of the world. The basis of my approach when I was Prime Minister towards China was to build a pragmatic relationship. My starting point was that although we potentially had a lot in common economically and people-to-people links were very valuable, Australia is the largest destination for Chinese students studying abroad, so that is a sign of the importance of the relationship. And in Australia, the combination of Mandarin and Cantonese is the most widely spoken foreign language in our country. So we have a lot of people-to-people links, but from the very beginning I took the attitude that we were a Western democracy and would always be so and should always be so. China had a different political system, provided we each understood that and we tried to focus on the things that we had in common, then we would get along quite well. Part and parcel of that was for us to encourage both the United States and China to play down the cross-state tensions and to bring whatever influence we could to bear on Taiwan likewise. And I think it's fair to say over the last decade those cross-strait tensions have lessened, and I think the Bush administration made a very big contribution to that, for which it's received very, very little credit. So what I sought to do was to focus on what we had in common and to build a pragmatic relationship, always recognising at the end of the day it was a very different political system, and there are certain things that you had to factor in the relationship with China that you mightn't factor in a relationship with Japan and Korea. And of course what I endeavoured to do also was to build the commonality of democracy with countries such as, or focus on the commonality of democracy with countries such as Japan and Korea, and of course naturally the United States, and more recently India, because I think one of the very significant developments in the last few years is the better relationships that have developed between the United States and India, initiated by the former President Bush and I think continued by the Obama administration. And I think it's a very important long-term development because India is the world's most populous democracy, and our relations with that country are very important. So my attitude to China is very much I welcome China's emergence. It's good for the country, it's good for the world, it's a natural development. I think we have to keep a clear head about it. China is an authoritarian country in a way that Australia, the United States and Korea isn't, but that doesn't mean to say we can't find common areas for agreement and concerted action. It doesn't mean that we can't continue to encourage the Chinese to exercise their influence over North Korea, for example, but always remember that the basis of the relationship between Australia and China is one of pragmatic mutual interest. We have a lot of resources that China wants. China is a growing and an enormously powerful country. I think we have to keep in perspective, though, her potential to challenge the United States years into the future. I think it's somewhat exaggerated. I think the United States will remain overwhelmingly the most powerful country in so many ways for an indefinite period of time, and I think we have to be careful once again to have a sense of balance and a proper perspective.
Let me ask you one more question, Prime Minister, before I turn to Prime Minister Lee Hong-boo.
Sure.
This is about the ASEAN group with 10 countries. And in fact, 2 months ago here in Jeju Island, we had a Korea-ASEAN summit meetings, a very historic meeting in the history of Korean diplomacy, which reflects the growing importance of ASEAN group in East Asia and the Pacific. Now, ASEAN countries are having a dialogue with 3 countries in Northeast Asia, including Korea, China, and Japan, but also another 3 countries in the region, including Australia and Indonesia. What is your view on the role of ASEAN in the regional economic integration and the common prosperity and the mutual benefits for the entire region from Australian viewpoint?
Well, largely and indeed wholly positive and benign. I regarded one of our very pleasing diplomatic achievements a few years ago was our participation, I think 4 years ago, for the first time in the East Asia Summit. And that's something that we had worked towards, and we were very grateful for the support that Indonesia had given for Australia's inclusion, because although it hasn't come up directly in this discussion from a bilateral point of view, Indonesia's relationship with my country is very, very important. It's not only our nearest neighbour, it's also the most populous Islamic country in the world. And I think the democratic achievement of Indonesia over the last decade has been one of the least saluted and least remarked achievements. I think it is amazing, the transformation of Indonesia from a military dictatorship in 1998 to the 3rd largest functioning democracy in the world. And I don't think the Indonesians have had enough credit for it. I think they deserve more. It's largely ignored in Europe and North America, and it's often overlooked in this part of the world. And it's of historic importance for so many reasons, not only this great transformation, but bear in mind that it is a country led by a government of moderate Islamic disposition, and that's very, very important in the struggle for the minds of Islamic youth around the world to see a democratic success, a liberal democratic success in the largest Islamic country in the world. I think that's important. The fact that it's next door to Australia is also of more than passing interest to me and to all Australians. But the East Asia Summit emergence was something we wanted, and we're very pleased about it, and we've always taken a very positive attitude towards ASEAN, and we welcome the fact that in recent years it's become somewhat more outward-looking. I think it went through a period of time influenced by 1 or 2 of its members where it didn't want it to be very outward-looking, but I think that's changed.
Maybe we can continue discussion on that if we have some questions from the floor later. But let me turn to Korean Peninsula, to Prime Minister Lee Hong-boo. Prime Minister Lee has pointed out that this community building process is very important compared to the confines of the national states in modern times because of the trans-border communications and connections and interactions among different countries, and also in terms of formulating a desirable regional order in East Asia and the Pacific. And it looks like despite efforts, patience and time and money spent by the government, the successive government in South Korea, the inter-Korean relationship is still under the burden of confrontation and mistrust and so on. And especially because of the recent events in North Korea, second nuclear detonation and the firing of missiles, the relationship is not in its good condition. So I think that while we continue to think very seriously about community building, as Prime Minister Lee himself has formulated 20 years ago in the form of the Korean Commonwealth idea, we also have to face the realities of the Korean Peninsula. And perhaps, in my view, we should have less of the wishful thinking, but more of the realistic assessment of the realities that we are faced with. I'd like to ask Prime Minister Lee Hong-goo's views on the current status of relations between two Koreas and where do we go from here?
Well, to put the matter in a very simple terms, as I sketched in my speech, the world is going through a very rapid transition to a community building, regional level as well as global level. So this is a historic trend. And I make all these points and I support our unification formula because I believe there is a difference in speed as to each state adjusting itself to this historic change. While there is such differences, there's no absolute exception to this. You cannot stay out of history. So now the really burden of the decision or choice is on the shoulders of North Korean leadership. Even belatedly, they could make a decision to join this overall trend and try to become a part of the Korean national community, part of Asian community, and part of global community, or decide to stay out of it altogether. If the decision is for the latter, I don't think there is any future. So what we've been trying to do, successive government, is to try to persuade North Korea to come along, and we're trying to be some help. We have ups and downs, as Dr. Park just mentioned, the nuclear tests, the missiles. It's a setback. But I personally, maybe the welcome is another right word, but I personally welcomed it because I see this as a sign of speeding up the process. You make these the dangerous moves, more or less telling the world that they are rather desperate. Well, we understand it, and I think everybody is trying to be of some help. That is, in those desperate situations, you have to make a right choice. And maybe the development of the last few days, the visit of President Clinton, or even some communication between two Koreas, will indicate the North Korea thinking about these hard choices. We very much hope that they will move toward the right direction.
Now you mentioned former President Clinton's visit to North Korea. I think it was very timely in a sense that when the tension was escalating in the Korean Peninsula, as we have seen in 1994 when the former President Jimmy Carter visited North Korea and met with Kim Il-sung and came back with some positive suggestions for the inter-Korean dialogue. This time, again, the former US President visited North Korea and brought the two American journalists back to the United States. And I wonder how much impact the Clinton visit, the Clinton diplomacy to North Korea will have on the improvement of relations between US and North Korea, and for that matter, the solution of the nuclear problems that we are faced with, Prime Minister.
I think it certainly will have some positive impact, because whenever North Koreans want to make some shift of policies or shift of positions, they need a rationale or legitimate reasons, face-saving mechanism to continue the support or continue to secure the support of the people. And from their view, the one best way to maintain their prestige is to bring the former President of the United States. That's what happened, as Dr. Park said, in 1994. You know, in the traditional societies in Asia particularly, the seniority counts. So former presidents look better than in other places when you visit North Korea. So I think Clinton visit should have some positive effect. Now, the remaining question is, as you said, what's in the minds of Kim Jong-il? Now, there are all kinds of interpretations as to what happened in 1994, so I don't need to go over to this, but had Kim Il-sung lived a few more months and had he gone through the summit meeting in July 25th, 1994 with the South, perhaps the history could have been different, because my guess was that the late Kim Il-sung had more or less decided to make a major shift in his policy. No other way to survive. The entire Eastern Europe was changing. The Soviet Union then was facing dissolution. And the Chinese, under the leadership of late Deng Xiaoping, is making a decisive move toward market economy. So you have to make a major adjustment. Now Kim Jong-il faces same choice. Unfortunately, 15 years after. And in those 15 years, from 1994 to 2009 this year, in my view, unnecessary sacrifices and sufferings on the part of North Koreans. Very bad. Nevertheless, I hope the Kim Jong-il will make a right decision at this juncture, which will help North Korea, which will help its population, and even belatedly, they could join the history and neighborhood building efforts. And, well, they are Koreans, even at this late juncture. If they make a right decision, I think they could move pretty fast. And we are prepared to help. So this is a kind of hopeful or optimistic scenario, but let's wait for a few weeks and see how things go.
I hope something positive can come out of this uncertainty surrounding the North Korean attitude. But let me point out that November this year, which is about 4 months to go, commemorates the 20th anniversary of the crumbling down of the Berlin Wall. And I understand that a big conference is going to take place in Jeju Island in November, at the same place here. Looking back 20 years ago, just several months before the coming down of the Berlin Wall, and I was in Bonn, Germany myself, to meet with the German experts on unification, and I asked this question to the expert, that when is Germany going to be united? Not knowing that the Berlin Wall will come down in several months' time. And the answer was that it may not, because Germany is already united in terms of economic, in terms of social, in terms of person-to-person exchange. And then the expert told me that Korea will be united perhaps before Germany would do. And of course, it was a wrong advice. But I see the point, nevertheless, that in the case of two Germanys, somehow there was a substantial contact and exchanges, interactions between the two sides. Whereas in the case of two Koreas, although we had signed the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement about 20 years ago, the first article of which says that both sides should recognize and respect the existence of two Koreas. Still, that is not happening as yet. So I see the irony of Germany and Korea. And the context of two cases are different. And also there are similarities. In East Asia, we have no NATO organization, we have no European Union. Two Koreas fought war against each other, unlike Germany. And also North Korea obviously has nuclear bombs, which East Germany didn't. So what lessons do we learn from German experience of unification, especially at this juncture of rising tension on the Korean Peninsula with the UN Security Council's sanctions on North Korea? What is your advice, Prime Minister, to both the Korean, South Korean government and also to North Korea?
I think you have sketched the German situation very well, and I too was in Bonn that year. I was a unification minister, and we had an annual sort of meeting between two divided countries to compare our notes. But the German leaders, including Chancellor Kohl, didn't know the unification was coming.
He was in Poland.
So the conclusion from that is that such a big change happens only when you are very lucky. So it's largely the question of luck in sometimes. And here I am also very hopeful, because Korea has been basically unlucky for 100 years, since 1910. So it's about time we get lucky. So I still maintain the hope that I'll see the unification coming to us within the next few years, at least in my lifetime. So, but again, as Dr. Park pointed out, Germany made a major and consistent effort to build or sustain national community. So they maintained as much relation with the Eastern Europe, Eastern Germany as possible, and gave a very substantial economic help. But more importantly, on so-called the Eastern policy or Ostpolitik and so on, Germany maintained a very strong bipartisanship between the Christian Democrats and Social Democrats. And that's essential to bring a success in any unification policies. And that's why I earlier mentioned the fact that the product of 1989, our Korean Commonwealth unification formula, the process was as important as the product. All the parties agreed. I remember the September 11th, I brought the final version of that formula to the National Assembly, and before the plenary session, had the coffee at the speaker's room, and we have the president of all four parties there. President Kim Dae-jung, President Kim Yong-sam, late Yoon Gil-chung was then the party chairman for the ruling party, and the former Prime Minister, J.P. Kim, and all said, well, this looks good. So when you have that sort of an internal consensus, it creates tremendous dynamics and, in a way, force North Korea to come to an agreement. So I would like to see that this type of effort to forge a consensus will take place within South Korea. And if we continue to make our effort to build a community building, what I call, I said it's about our turn to get lucky. So all in all, while some of the developments like nuclear tests and others seem somewhat discouraging, I say the clock is moving. And I think the day of making a major forward movement toward unification is not too far away.
Well, I think that continued efforts and patience of engagement with North Korea will perhaps be the best scenario that we can think of at the moment, and try to dissuade North Korea to give up its nuclear ambitions and to open up its country to get seriously engaged with the international community, become a responsible member of the global village. And I think that's the policy of this government under the title of Mutual Benefits and Common Prosperity, which is the theme of this grand conference. But let me tell you one story about German advice to the Korean unification. When I was press secretary in the presidential office, and when the Prime Minister was ambassador to the St. James Court, German Chancellor Helmut Kohl came to the Blue House and gave advice to the President at that time, Kim Young-sam. And he said, when the window of opportunity for unification opens, then you should grab it. And the President said, thank you very much for your advice. That will be a very major decision. And then another German leader, Helmut Schmidt, came to Korea and visited the presidential office and said, Mr. President, when the window of opportunity for unification opens on the Korean peninsula, think twice. And the President asked me, which advice should I take? And I said, maybe both. And I think that when the time is ripe for the Korean unification, and when the window opens sometime in the future, perhaps I think we should have two things in mind. That perhaps we should grab it, but knowing what is going to happen afterwards. Let me just wind up the discussion by touching upon one important issue which has not been discussed yet, and that is the climate change and the global efforts to tackle these challenges on the United Nations level and the regional level, on the national level. I know Secretary Ban Ki-moon is going to arrive in Jeju Island this evening and will give a main speech tomorrow morning. So I'd like to ask both Prime Ministers give good